So good morning. Welcome to this IAM webinar. I hope you can hear me and you all had a nice Easter break. So Mike Doujak and I, we are both product managers of Airlock IAM, are going to hold this webinar and are very happy to welcome you on this IAM 776 webinar. Just by the way, for those of you who are new in this webinar, you can also send us chat messages and you can also ask questions. And we'll try to catch up with the questions during the webinar. And if we are not, if we are not able to catch up, we will do so at the end of the webinar and answer all the questions. Maybe if somebody could confirm in the chat that you can hear me, that would be great. And thanks. Okay, already got it. So then we will start, and so this webinar will be about new features in IAM 7.6. But first, before starting with the new features, I would like, as in the second last and the last webinar, also again mention our plan of the Loginapp migration. If you are still using the JSP-Loginapp, the old style Loginapp based on Java servlet pages, then you should definitely plan a migration now. You can get more information on the link shown here, airlock.com/loginapp-migration. And here is again our schedule of the deprecation of the JSP-Loginapp. I know some of you already joined the last webinar and already know this, but I think it's still worth showing it to everybody again. So what you can see here is the arrow, the black arrow is where we are now. We just released IAM 7.6. There will be one more release, 7.7, in half a year from now. That will be the last release containing the old JSP-Loginapp, and it will still be supported by middle of 2024. So that's our plan. That's when you need to be off the JSP-Loginapp and migrated to the new Loginapp. So in a year from now, there will be IAM 8.0. This will be the first release without the JSP-Loginapp. From then, you still have time until middle of 2024, where the JSP-Loginapp will still be supported, but we will not put in new features into the JSP-Loginapp then. So if you have questions about the migration or if you need help, then best thing is go to the current documentation of Airlock IAM 7.6, go to chapter 4.6. It's within the release notes as shown on the left, and there you will find all the information, also this schedule, and there are links to the list of features that we are no more supporting in the new Loginapp, and there's also a feature reference showing for every JSP-Loginapp feature when it will be migrated or when it has been migrated, and some hints how it can be used. So I think this is especially important to note. I ask you, if you didn't do that yet, please go through this list, especially go to the list through the list of discontinued features and give us feedback if we took some wrong decisions, if we probably deprecated a feature that you desperately need. We don't know every of our customers and how they are using Airlock IAM, so it might be that we have deprecated one or the other feature that you still need. So please let us know. The list is here for that, so that you can give us feedback on that. If you have any questions, ask us, open a support ticket or an order ticket or email us. There are also in the documentation, there's also hints on services that we provide supporting you in the migration if that is required. So then let's go to the new features in Airlock IAM 7.6. It's roughly about these 4 areas of features, and then there are some more miscellaneous features. And we will start first with the OpenID Connect provider, and with that I hand over to Mike.
Thanks, Marc. OpenID Connect provider. Just wanted to remind you a little bit of what it actually is that we did over the past few iterations of IAM. And it all started out in 7.3, where we introduced the AS-centric authorization server for OAuth and OpenID Connect. You remember the AS-centric authorization server is the version where you can have multiple clients and you can either configure them directly in the configuration or you can register them using dynamic client registration. We then went on with IAM 7.4, just some minor updates. A real big step forward was IAM 7.5, where we implemented REST UI support for using IAM as an OAuth client. And now we're at 7.6, and we completed the journey by adding the REST UI for the authorization server, so you can use it now to authenticate and issue access, refresh, and ID tokens directly in with the new UI. So in essence, what this means is that we're now 100% complete with the journey for OAuth and OpenID Connect, and the new Loginapp will support all the features that we have. Now, what are those features? Well, you have OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect authorization server. It's integrated with the UI, and you can take advantage of everything the Flow architecture has to offer. We're also supporting local consents, meaning the UI where a user can accept scopes or not accept scopes and make his consent felt. We're also supporting a rather easy migration from the old JSP-Loginapp. So it's very simple, for example, to integrate OpenID Connect or OAuth with mobile applications. We've improved the URL scheme, but the old URLs still work. So as a customer, there is no need to change existing OpenID Connect clients quickly because the old URLs are still supported, so we're fully backward compatible. So this is a feature set of what we've done, a little bit on the configuration. Just to explain to you how things are connected with regards to OpenID Connect and the new login app. There's the target application, which has a connection to the authentication flow. You need to configure a flow UI to actually use the user interface, and there is some configuration in the authorization server. I will now look at all these four aspects a little bit more in detail. In the target application, you need to configure an identity propagation plugin that is for OAuth and OpenID Connect, because that plugin will actually issue the access, refresh, and ID token for you. Without that plugin, you won't get those tokens, and it completes the authorization code flow correctly. The second thing you need to do is the authentication flow. It must contain a consent step, otherwise scopes are not handled correctly, and of course the user is not shown a consent screen, so that's a must-have in the authentication flow. The flow UI is rather simple, as always with flows. If you want to use the single page application, the new login app, then you must have a flow UI configured. And last but not least, there is the authorization server. And in the authorization server, there's quite a few things you optionally can configure, but you don't have to. The only thing you need to tell it is what the target application is, so it starts the correct authentication flow during an authorization code flow to use the new login app. If a client wants to determine what kind of authentication strength should be used, then ACR values are interpreted here, and you can map them to different target application, meaning to different authentication flows. In the example you see here, I'm using this feature to determine on whether weak authentication with just username password or strong authentication with a second factor is required. What you also have here is scope handling. So a client requests some scopes, you can filter those, then those filter scopes are being presented to the end user to obtain his consent, and then they are added to the access token later on. And last but not least, you have the login hint, which can be used to either process an SSO ticket or just to provide a user, that the client can provide a username that will be shown on the username password page to make things more convenient for the end user. All of this is documented. There's 2 entry points into the documentation that I would like to point out here. The first one is more generic information, which shows a sequence diagram, how control is handed back and forth between the flow architecture and the OAuth or OpenID Connect server. The second entry here gives you detailed instruction on how to configure the Loginapp REST UI to support OAuth and OpenID Connect. So that's it for OAuth and OpenID Connect. And now Marc will take over and he'll talk to you about the SAML identity provider.
Thank you, Mike. So very similar to what Mike said about OpenID Connect and OAuth, in IAM 7.6 we implemented the SAML identity provider side for the new Loginapp and for authentication flows. So in a little bit more detail, what does that comprise? So it's, as I said, it's the identity provider. It's not the SP side, so it's not the service provider side. It's if IAM is used as identity provider. If it is used as a service provider, this will be in the upcoming release in half a year in 7.7. So it basically combines the SAML identity provider, as you already probably know it, with the authentication flow. It supports single sign-on and single logout profiles. It supports IDP and SP initiated single sign-on and single logout. Auth and context classes can be used, for example, for step-up. That's a little bit more flexible than before. We also, as Mike said, in OAuth implementation, we also improved the URL scheme, so URLs are a bit more logic than before. But here's also the good message is the old URLs, of course, still works exactly as they were, so there's no need to adapt any remote service providers in their configuration. So that's we're fully backwards compatible for all remote service providers. They should not be able to distinguish between the old or the new implementation. We implemented it in a way so it's relatively easy to migrate from the JSP-Loginapp, the SAML part, to the new Loginapp. We removed some of the, but not all of the configuration properties from the XML files used for SAML configuration to the config editor, but the standardized XML files, the metadata files, for SAML metadata files, they still reside in the configuration. So SAML is still a complex topic, so I suggest you follow the docs tutorials which have been rewritten for the new Loginapp, and you should find everything in there. So I will now switch to the config editor here to show you a bit of the configuration. I hope you can read it. If you cannot read it, please send a message in chat or in the questions panel so Mike can tell me. So what we have here, let's make a refresh to be sure I'm still logged in. So just by the way, I thought about just demonstrating how SAML is used, but actually that's not really funny because you won't see anything in the browser. It's just a few redirects and so. So I decided to show you part of the configuration. So I open the Loginapp here and go to the SAML settings. For those of you who've already configured SAML in the JSP-Loginapp will be familiar with this part. Now in a new configuration of 7.6, we still have all the JSP-Loginapp settings regarding SAML, and we have new settings regarding SAML with the flow authentication. In there, you as used in the JSP-Loginapp, we have the IDP settings. I won't go into them into details there. And what is new, we have here a list of service provider settings for the remote SPs. In the JSP-Loginapp, these were they were reachable only via target application, and then they're in a special target application type for SAML. So here we have all the SAML settings together, and we have all the SAML relevant stuff of the service providers also here in the SAML settings. I go into one of those. Now, the important question is, how is a SAML service provider, so remote service provider, actually a target application, how is it linked to the authentication flow that should be used to access this target application, or where the SAML assertion should be sent to? And this is modeled or solved by using an application ID here in the configuration. All the rest is SAML-specific stuff as you had it before in the old Loginapp. And here we have the link to the application that is actually meant by this SAML SP. The other way around, if I go to Loginapp, authentication flows, and have the list of applications, here I have this same application that I opened in SAML, and here you see we have a SAML identity propagator, which is again linked to the corresponding SAML SP entity ID. So in this way, by this way, you can access directly the application, and then the application definition here in IAM knows which SAML SP entity ID to use, or you can do it the other way around. If you choose SP initiated single sign-on, then you will start on the SAML endpoint, and the SAML endpoint then knows which application is meant by that. So I go back to the slides. I will skip these slides because I just showed you that in the demo. This was just if the demo didn't work. So I think this is the most important new stuff, is how to link an application, target application, to a SAML service provider, and vice versa. Some cautions or some limitations. You can only use SAML in the new or in the old Loginapp, but not mix both words together. So if you are in the case using IAM both as SAML IDP and SAML SP, then you cannot migrate. Then you have to wait for 7.7 because you cannot mix both SAML words in one IAM instance. All the rest of the limitations, including the second point here, no multi-IDP, is as in the JSP-Loginapp. So we didn't remove any possibilities. We made a lot of stuff more flexible because it can be used with the flow world. But we still have some limitations that you have to know when setting up SAML. So the last point is especially important. You cannot really use configuration context to all extent in conjunction with SAML. So all the details you can find in the documentation. As I said, we rewrote the SAML documentation for the new Loginapp, and you should find all the information there, how to set up the IDP, how to step-by-step add SPs, how to use authentication context classes, and so on. And including a longer list of detailed limitations. Okay, then I will switch to the next feature. One of the new features in 7.6 is the so-called Remember Me feature. Remember Me is a feature that we had in the old Loginapp in a very basic form, and when we transported it to the new Loginapp, we made it more powerful and a lot more flexible. So the Remember Me feature is usually what you know when you look at this screenshot with this checkbox which says keep me logged in. It's actually you log in, the browser gets a persistent cookie or some other kind of token, and when you come back you're already logged in. That's the basic functionality of Remember Me. Now what is new in the new Loginapp? First of all, now you can use it in the new Loginapp at all. This has not been the case in 7.5. But for those who knew the old feature, they know it was really very basic. We didn't really store anything per browser. We just had one field in the user record for all the remembered browsers. Now in 7.6 there is really a new database table, or actually it's more than one database table, and we store a token for each browser as you would expect it, and we also store some context data per browser, like the client IP, the timestamp, if configured, the geolocation, and so on. What is also very important is, depending on how you use this feature, you want to behave, IAM to behave differently when logging out. So what happens if I press the logout button? Should the remember me token be cleared or not? So this depends on how you use it. And how it is implemented in the authentication flow is actually as two separate steps. If you look at the config snippet on the below right bottom of the page, you see a simple authentication flows with 3 steps. In the middle is the actual authentication, it's the password authentication step. On top is what we call the user identifying step, the remember me user identifying step, sorry. This one is the step that extracts the token from the request, verifies it, and if the user is already logged in, then identifies the user and also sets some tag, which allows you, for example, that's just an example, to skip the password step. And if the first 2 steps are successful, then the third step will generate a new remember me token, store it in the browser. So with this very, very simple example is actually what you see in the screenshot above. It's the keep me logged in checkbox on the login screen. Passing through the whole outflow of these 3 steps, you will get a remember me token in the browser. If you come back the next time, the first step, the identifying step, will identify the user and set the tag, and if configured correctly, then skip the second step and the user is logged in. As you see here, you can, of course, combine it with any authentication flow, adding a second step after the first 2 steps, or do whatever you like in the flow. So it's a lot more flexible. If you're interested in that, what you should definitely look at is the dynamic step activation feature, because it's based on that. It's a very general feature allowing you, the user, to choose to enable steps in a flow, like the keep me logged in checkbox here enables the remember me token generating step in this flow. If interested, have a look at that in the documentation. It allows you to do a lot more than just remember me feature. So a second usage of these 2 steps is showing that you can really use it in different ways, because it's in the outflow, is what we call skip second factor. It's just a different use case with exactly the same feature used. So in the flow, you see here on the bottom right, we have the password step first. It will always be there, so the user is always asked for the password. And then we have the remember me user identifying step before the second authentication step, which is here an Airlock 2FA step. It's just an example. And what this does is, if you check the checkbox, don't ask me again for 30 days, it's shown on the second factor. And then log in with the second factor. Then for the next 30 days, this token will be valid, the remember me token, and the user is no more asked for the second factor during this period, just as an example. So you probably know this from like Microsoft logins or similar logins that provide this. So feel free to use these 2 remember me steps in any other way, and you can also implement different use cases. You will find details about both these use cases and the feature in general in the manual. There's also step-by-step tutorials how to configure these 2 use cases in detail. So then I give the word back to Mike, who is talking about Airlock 2FA improvements.
Thanks, Marc. Airlock 2FA is, well, our favorite authentication second factor, and we're always improving it. And this time in IAM 7.6, there's two things that I would like to talk about. The first one is about fraud. Maybe if you've noticed then when you're using the Airlock 2FA app, that for an authentication or for transaction approval, that first asks you on whether you want to approve this action. And you can either say approve, yes, I want to, or you can hit the cancel button to decline it. And then there is a second question where actually the app asks you on whether you requested this action or not. Now, in the past, saying yes or no to whether you requested this action didn't make a difference. With IAM 7.6, you can configure it to make a difference. And if the user actually says, no, I did not request this action, then you can automatically lock the account. The reasoning behind this is fairly simple. If a user first declines to authenticate or declines to approve a transaction and then says, hey, I actually didn't start this, then it's very likely that somebody else is trying to access his Airlock 2FA app and to take over his account. And we really don't want that, so account locking is a reasonable reaction to this. To add, there is optional features that you can use and to improve user convenience. The first one that I would like to point out is event notification by email. So you can let the user know that his account was locked. And the reason was because he said no in the Airlock 2FA app, and you can give him some explanation on what went on actually. You can also let him know that, and that's the second option, that there is a self-unlock service if he wants to regain control of his account. And in the documentation, and that's why all of this are links, in the documentation it will tell you on how to configure the self-unlock service so a user can recover his account and also gain control over Airlock 2FA again. So that's the first feature with locking a user account if he reports that fraud has happened on his user account. The second feature that I would like to talk about is support for mobile-only enrollment. If you look at your user community, you'll find that there's a lot of people out there that really like to use your applications with just their mobile phone or maybe some tablet. And to support that better, it should also be possible to use a mobile phone only to enroll Airlock 2FA as a second factor. Now, the login or the authentication flow that I'm demonstrating right now will give you an indication of what we've done within this authentication flow. The first screen would be the login screen. You enter username and password, and you hit login. And since we're talking about a migration scenario, it will now ask you on whether you want to migrate to Airlock 2FA. In my example, of course, I want to do the migration now, and that's when you get presented the QR code. And here is where the new magic happens. You see below the QR code, there is a new checkbox or button that you can click, which allows you to directly open the Airlock 2FA app. And if you click that button, the operating system will take over and will ask you on whether you really want to open the Airlock 2FA app or not. And of course, you want to send this QR code to the Airlock 2FA application. You click on Öffnen or Open, and it will automatically add the new account to the Airlock 2FA app, and the migration to a new second factor has been completed. All of that happening directly within the Airlock 2FA app or within the mobile phone. If you do not like that feature, since it's enabled by default, there is also the option to to remove the configuration. This is done as follows. You have to use a customized step UI. So in the Authentication and Authorization UI plugin, you add Airlock 2FA Activation Authentication UI to the customized step UI, and inside this plugin, you find that you have an option to that you can turn off the Show App Device Activation link. So if your user experience specialists think that supporting mobile only is a bad idea, then you can disable this. So that's it for Airlock 2FA. but we're not at the end of the webinar yet. We have various other new features, which I would like to talk about now. The first one is user-specific role timeouts. This is a feature that we've supported in the JSP-Loginapp since a long time already, and we've now added it to the new Loginapp, and it works the same as it did before. You're able to define the idle time and the lifetime timeouts for roles, and it will be communicated to the Airlock gateway, and the Airlock gateway will drop those roles after the timeout period has been done. I also would like to add a few hints for the new IAM. The first one is about the H2 database. H2 have found a serious security issue with the version 1.x of H2, and this security issue has forced us to upgrade the H2 database to the version 2. Unfortunately, this upgrade it cannot be automatically migrated. It requires manual intervention. You have to export the data using the old version of the database and import the data again into the new version of the database. We've always recommended not to use H2 in production environments, but if you're using them in integration or test environments, you either have to migrate the data manually, or, which is what we do most often of the time, you just drop the database, it gets reinitialized when you start IAM, and you can continue working with it. Second notice is that we've removed Zero Touch. Zero Touch was no longer supported on iOS since a couple of months already, because Apple's very stringent on the microphone use, and Zero Touch uses the microphone because it's a sound-based risk approach. Now, on Android, you also get more and more messages on screen that the app tries to use the microphone, and we had some rather negative end-user feedback because they don't really like their mobile phones to use the microphone all the time. So this was removed there as well. The app's no longer supported, and with IAM 7.6, we also removed the functionality from the product. The last thing that I would like to point out is that the old password reset API has been deprecated. It will be removed with IAM 8.0, so you should go forward and start using the new password reset, which is flow-based, much more functional, much more flexible than the old implementation. The last thing I would like to point out is PEPAR. That's Privilege Escalation Protected Administrator Roles. Let me first introduce what actually the problem is. When you're looking at administrator management and configuration management, those are authorizations within the admin app that you can be a problem security-wise because they can be used to escalate privileges. A configuration manager can add additional roles to authorizations in the configuration, and administrator management cannot be limited to manage only certain administrators, or at least that was not possible before we introduced PEPAR. With PEPAR, we're actually introducing two tiers of administrators, kind of the super admins and the regular admins. Super admins can do everything. The regular admins can only manage their own administrators, but they cannot manage super admins. Let me give you an example on how this works. We have here on the right-hand side in green two types of administrators, one to administer users, adding them, deleting them, editing them, and we have the help desk, which basically can help users if they lock their account, if they need some token change, or to just look at the user tray to support them with some tasks that the user is trying to achieve but cannot do themselves. Now, it would be nice to have an administrator that basically is able to create new user admin, create new help desk administrators. Maybe this is actually the manager of the help desk in a large organization, or it might be some other role that administers all these people. Now, on top of the administrator, there should be other roles where the administrator has no access, and what's of particular interest is, of course, the configuration administration. And PEPAR does exactly that. If you put configurator and super admin on the PEPAR list, then the red administrator will not be able to even see those, much less to add or delete or edit them. whereas the super admin and configurator will be able to continue the work as they have been before. Now, the good news about PEPAR is if you don't enable it, IAM will continue to work as it did in the past 10 or 15 years. So there's no need to change anything. But if you want to take advantage of the enhanced security regarding administrator roles, this example should give you an indication on how it can be used. So that's it on PEPAR. Now, Marc will have some remarks on the webinar, some closing notes.
So first thing is about the Log4j vulnerabilities. I'm sure most of all of you have heard or been involved in the Log4j vulnerabilities that have been published in December. So if you look at the newest Airlock IAM release, it's also true for the bug fix releases that we issued just like a day or two after the vulnerabilities have been published. If you look at it a bit more closely and look at the libraries that are inside, you may be confused because it's not a newest Log4j 2. whatever version in there. So I'm showing you this just to make sure that you're not too much alarmed about that. The way Log4j fixed the problem and issued new versions would be really very breaking for probably all of our customers. So what we did is we actually took the old Log4j vulnerabilities and patched them so they are not vulnerable. Actually, all the vulnerable code has really been removed from the file, and it has also been externally reviewed. So that's the reason why, if you look at it, you will find some Log4j jars with an Ergon patch version on it, which may possibly be the source for alarms for scanner. So if you need to know more about that, look at the known issues list in the tech zone, or don't hesitate to talk to us or to ask us about this. So then the next and the second last slide of this webinar is if you are looking at Airlock IAM 7.6, then I ask you, please go to the documentation and look for, especially for the action required when upgrading, look at the changelog. I think the best thing is I show you what I mean. Here I'm in the documentation IAM 7.6. Then just click on release notes. You will see all the high level stuff, and especially what we told you today. But you can also see that we did a lot of other stuff, all the changelog here. But I think most important is the first part is action required when upgrading. Here you will find also more information about what Mike said about the H2 database migration, for example. There are detailed information about that on what Mike told you about Airlock 2FA mobile-only enrollment and so on. You will find all the details here. And as usual for minor releases is also here, it's the case with the exception of the H2 database, that if you are using features that have already been present in the prior release, like 7.5 or 7.4, if you don't use new features, you usually don't have to migrate anything manually, except for this H2 database stuff. And then another very important page is have a look at the deprecation announcement. So this is a cumulative page, so it is extended with every release. So here we document since 7.0 what we are planning to remove in 8.0 or even the next major release after 8.0. So please have a look at this list. A lot of the stuff has been deprecated long ago, sometimes years ago, but have a look at it and to figure out if it affects you or if it doesn't affect you. It's very important to know what expects you in 8.0. Here, there's also details about what Mike said about the password reset API being deprecated, because there are several old password reset APIs. Here you will find all the details, which endpoints are affected and so on. oops. Then also a hint for academy trainings. You can have a look at www.airlock.com/academy. There are academy trainings, upcoming academy trainings you can book if you are interested. Then the last slide of the webinar is the release schedule. 7.6 was already released on end of March. And as always, it's available on Docker, both on Docker Hub or on Airlock Tech Zone. If you choose to pull it from Docker Hub, you will also find information in the documentation on how you can access this, because you need an access token for that. Okay, there is, as we said, there's no manual migration required from 7.5 to 7.6, except for the exception we noted about H2. The release will be supported until the end of next year. And if you are still using 7.4 or older, we recommend that you update soon to 7.6. Okay, then that was it. And we thank you for your for joining us in the webinar, and hope to hear from you soon. And then we will try to get all the open questions answered, and wish you a nice day.
We have a first question. Someone is asking, I have installed Airlock IAM in AWS EC2 instance for demo purposes. And the question is, do I need a license, and how do I get to the...
Give me a second so we can see all the questions here. Yeah.
And the second part of the question is, how can I access the Loginapp from the browser? So with regards to the license, yes, you do need a license key. You always need a license key when you're trying to run Airlock IAM, regardless of whether it's for demo purposes or for production purposes.
But you can request a demo license, so you can request a trial license, which will be for free. To do that, place an email at order@airlock.com. So they can provide you with a demo license or a test license, which usually you don't have to pay anything for it. It will be limited in usage, in time, and also in the amount of features.
Now the question is, do you know how to access the Loginapp from the browsers?
Now it depends on you. First, will have to configure the Loginapp. You can, for example, use the demo setup. I think I'll just show you how you do that. For those who are interested, I hope then they will stay. And if anybody has to leave, then of course you just leave. So once you installed Airlock IAM according to the installation instructions, then you log into the admin app. If you do a first installation, you can just log in using any password. And then you will also not see most of the menus on the left because it's not configured. You go to configuration, and the configuration editor opens. It will be basically empty. If you like to use it as, if you like to use the demo application, then you just click on New, choose the demo application, demo configuration here, and you will have a setup that also configures the Loginapp. Because when starting with an empty configuration, there will be no Loginapp configured because we start with a secure closed configuration where you can do basically nothing except of configuring. So you can choose this demo application and then actually activate it. So when you look closer at the documentation in the quick start guide in the documentation, you will also see that during the installation you will have to enable this H2, this embedded H2 database. So you have a demo database, and this demo configuration that I loaded here, it will automatically connect to the demo application, to the demo database, as you see it here. With that, you should be able to access the Loginapp, and the Loginapp is reachable depending on how you configure the instance. If you just configure the Loginapp as it is in the quick startup guide, so you choose, for example, the instance to be named OAuth, so then the URL will just be your host and then auth login /. So in this case, this won't work because I'm connecting through a reverse proxy here, but probably this works. No, the port. So the exact URL, it depends on what port you chose in the configuration. The default is 8443, and on the name of the instance, which is auth here, which is now all standard if you configure it. If you implement it or install it on AWS EC2, then of course you have to make sure you have to configure AWS so you can connect from the outside to this URL that you see here. I hope that answers the question. Okay, thank you. Good. Then we see no other open questions. If there, we will keep the webinar open for a few more minutes. If there are more questions, then we will answer them in the question tool, meaning writing down the answers in the tool. So thank you again very much, everybody, and we wish you a nice day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.